So we can fast forward a century, and we're all familiar with the continued stereotypes about black women that paint our reproduction as, sexuality and reproduction as reckless. The welfare queen, who was supposed to have children just to get a welfare check and didn't care about those children at all. She spent the money on herself, wasting taxpayers' money. The pregnant crack addict who was supposed to trade sex for crack, and then that was supposed to chemically deprive her of maternal instinct, and then she was supposed to transmit to her babies the effects of crack, which were described erroneously as depriving then her children of a social conscience. Again, this idea of reckless sex that leads to reckless childbearing that passes down a depraved lifestyle to children. This is very recent portrayal of black mothers in major newspapers and in major scientific journals, now all discredited, but in the late 80s and early 90s, it was rampant and held as truth, this obvious myth. Politicians, policymakers, sociologists, demographers, public health experts, and the media all cast black women's sexuality as an urgent social problem. Black women have irresponsible sex and too many babies, they say, and they transmit this innate depravity to their children either genetically, and I could give another lecture on all the theories about black women's genetic predisposition to all sorts of horrible things that they pass on to their children, or chemically through drugs, or culturally because they just don't know how to raise children. The icons of black female sexual irresponsibility are routinely circulated to support birth control, including sterilization, coercive sterilization of black women, welfare reform, now a behavior modification program, not an entitlement, foster care, with black children hugely overrepresented in the foster care system, most of these children coercively taken from black mothers, and law enforcement policies, with black mothers being the fastest growing group incarcerated in the United States. All of these brutalized black women's bodies in the most dehumanizing ways. So, black women are overrepresented in the punitive welfare, prison, and foster care systems, and these systems then are all propped up by ideologies and images that portray black women as pathologically hypersexual and hyperfertile. And they all reinforce the principle that depraved sexuality, whoever is classified as the type of person whose sex is depraved, okay, that is a social threat, and that social threat warrants harsh state intervention. What's really so powerful about this image of restrained black women is that it sends a message that they aren't victims of state violence. Just the opposite. Society is their victims of them somehow. Victims of their threat to the social order. And if you want to be safe and respectable, you will distinguish yourself from these women by pledging allegiance to the ideologies and institutions that keep them under control. I think that is one of the most powerful ways that an obviously brutal, undemocratic, inhumane set of systems persist in this country. The threat of these women, the most marginalized women in our society, somehow made to be so threatening that people will support the most brutal systems, torture of people for fear of being like them. But the truth is, if you want to be free, you would spend your time trying to release these women. Black women's sexuality actually is threatening because black women have no vested interest in paying sexual allegiance to white male rule. They have nothing to gain from it. As the Combahee River Collective stated, they embody an adversarial position that has no stake in white heterosexist marriage or in white biological purity. What better position from which to imagine and fight for a liberated sexuality? Or liberated sexualities, I should say. Yet black women's expressions of their own sexualities are often silenced by the mainstream media, by policymakers, and by their own communities. Slavery stereotypes linking natural black femaleness to sexual promiscuity and black female respectability to sexlessness have left a gaping void in the cultural terms needed for black women to freely and publicly define their own sexual identities. It's extremely difficult in a culture still steeped in those slavery images of Jezebel and Mammy to imagine a positive black female sexuality because black women's bodies and behaviors are so easily seen as animalistic and depraved. And if you need to see what I'm talking about, just look at the commentary about Serena Williams's physique in social media. It's disgusting. It's vile. Redeeming the black female body has often meant desexualizing it. After emancipation, black club women created a politics of respectability that aimed, and I don't want to dismiss it or criticize it completely, it aimed at redeeming black women's bodies. But it emphasized chastity as a key means of erasing the sexual stigma inherited from slavery. Although calling attention to black women's victimization, the campaign for respectability placed most of the responsibility for redressing it on the survivors themselves, especially those who were of a so-called lower class than the women who were leading the campaign. The prescribed remedy was a hidden sexuality that denied sexual expression rather than a liberated sexuality that promoted black women's self-definition. Reconstructing black women's sexuality became as much a duty to salvage the entire race from disrepute as a means to liberate black women themselves. I think that's why it's so tricky for black female celebrities to resist these sexual stereotypes without bowing on the one hand to dominant values that delight in placing black female bodies on display for entertainment, or on the other hand, to the requirements of respectability that tend to silence their sexual expression. After my lecture last week, Barbara Savage sent me an email reminding me how even performances like Beyonce's are heteronormative and disappear black women who are lesbians, whose sexuality is perhaps the most invisible of anyone's. In her classic 1989 article, Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, Kimberly Crenshaw described how black women fall through the cracks of leading civil rights doctrines. Both feminist theory and anti-racist policy discourse tend to exclude black women because both are predicated on a discrete set of experiences, those of white women and black men, respectively, that doesn't reflect the interaction of race and gender in the particular way black women are subordinated. That was Crenshaw's original focus of intersectionality theory. Of course, it's expanded, and as the Combahee River Collective statement shows it, it's more than that. But one aspect of it is the way in which Black women's experiences and interests and identities get erased in dominant feminist and anti-racist discourse. Now, 27 years later, as director of the African American Policy Forum, Crenshaw has been calling, once again, attention to the same problem in the media's reporting of police brutality and in President Obama's My Brother's Keeper initiative, starting the Say Her Name campaign to insist on recognizing the names of Black women and girls killed by the police. This treatment of Black women goes beyond erasure to downright hostility, what Moya Bailey coined in 2010 as misogynoir, to describe the unique ways Black women are pathologized in American popular culture. Other women on Black Twitter have applied the term to the particular hatred directed at Black women who resist sexual stereotypes and repression. Feminista Jones told The Guardian that she has experienced this backlash most often from Black men. Quote, "In my campaigning on street harassment, I've been targeted because I'm a Black woman who is vocal. They don't go to anybody from Holla Back or Stop Street Harassment, those are campaigns run by white women. They will say I'm a traitor and call me a tool for white supremacy, just because I'm calling out their very targeted misogynoir." Over the last several years, an anti-abortion billboard campaign in cities like Atlanta, Chicago, and New York literally reiterated the message that Black women's wombs are dangerous. The most dangerous place for an African American is in the womb. Same message I've been talking about, right? And also the companion message that Black women are committing racial genocide when they have abortions. Again, this idea that Black women who seek control of their bodies are traitors to the race. Meanwhile, many white women, even some feminists, seek liberation by appropriating Black women's sexy looks and moves. Think Rachel Dolezal, Miley Cyrus, you think of others, but fail to center Black women's experiences and keep Black women from taking the lead in political organizing. Some continue to support coercive birth control and foster care policies that pit responsible, liberal, middle-class white women against irresponsible, low-income Black women and girls in need of their benevolent protection. And here, you want some examples of that. I'm thinking of recent programs insisting that so-called at-risk teens, which means Black and Latina teens, are pressured to use certain long-acting reversible contraceptives because their pregnancies are a social problem. And I'm also thinking of some advocacy by white liberal women to so-called free Black children from their mothers in order to allow them to be transracially adopted. I can't understand when some people in the women's liberation or Black liberation movements marginalize Black women, tell us to take a back seat, to wait for the revolution, and then our interests can be considered. The revolution can't happen without ending the oppression of Black women, which is the glue that sticks together all the pieces of the repressive white supremacist patriarchal apparatus. It's so ironic that black women are called race and sex traders precisely when they are acting as traders to white male rule. Now, despite the weight of centuries of vilifying stereotypes, dehumanizing institutions, punitive policies, and misogynoir, or maybe because of it, black women have resisted. Black women across the country are organizing for reproductive and sexual justice and inventing new liberation paradigms. You might recognize me. I love this march. I recently wrote a piece in Dissent about how the left can win the struggle for reproductive rights. And I said, I was thinking about when was the last time I felt like we could win. And it was on this march. And part of the reason was because black women took over the march. It was a march for choice. And Loretta Ross at Sister Song became sort of the national coordinator, and we brought in busloads and busloads of black women and changed the whole focus from a focus on basically giving middle-class white women more choices to a social justice movement that was needed to save women's lives. Black feminists have been at the forefront of transforming thinking about sexual and reproductive freedom from this framework of choice, which offers very limited protection against state interference, if any, and only for the most privileged women, to a framework of justice, social justice, what we call reproductive justice, or RJ. They came out of movements against violence and sterilization abuse, as much as abortion rights, and out of grassroots organizing, as much as professional reproductive rights organizations. Reproductive justice places sexual and reproductive health and decision-making in their political context of racism, sexism, homophobia, and economic oppression. And it treats the fight for sexual liberation as part of a broader struggle for social justice. In 2011, Sister Song Women of Color Collective for Reproductive Justice held a national Let's Talk About Sex conference in Miami. And sexual liberation has always been a key part of reproductive justice organizing. And there, hundreds of black women and other women of color came together to discuss strategies for contesting repressive social policies and building our own vision of sexual freedom. Sister Song and other reproductive justice organizations have launched a campaign called Trust Black Women to counter the anti-abortion billboards. And I love this idea of trust black women because it so contests the ideologies that have held that black women have to be managed, that they can't make decisions for their own bodies, for their children, for their communities. This is a big billboard that Sister Reach put up in Memphis. I don't deserve to be changed. Trust me to make the best decisions for myself, my family, and my community. Black feminists have developed a sophisticated analysis of state protection against intimate violence that places it in the context of state violence against black women and men. They start from the premise that policies to protect black women must address intimate and institutional violence simultaneously, and therefore can't rely on state systems such as the police and prisons and foster care, which themselves unjustly target black communities for violence. Black feminists also situate private violence within a broader context of inequitable social structures, including male domination, but also barriers created by poverty, racism, homophobia, and government policies that trap many women in violent homes, jobs, shelters, and streets. We caution against participating in a criminal justice regime that incarcerates astronomical numbers of black men, women, and children, causing devastating consequences to our families and communities. Black women are at heightened risk of being victimized by police brutality, including sexually assaulted, as the Daniel Holtzclaw case revealed, but it's much more widespread than one police officer in one city. And even when they seek protection against domestic and sexual violence. Aura Rosser, Tanisha Anderson, both were killed by police when their families called for protection. And Barbara Dawson, the woman in red, is the woman who was arrested when she sought medical care and thrown to the ground. Well, she collapsed to the ground, actually in handcuffs, as the police were trying to get her into a police car. Now, her only crime was insisting on seeing a doctor because she couldn't breathe. And she died. She had a blood clot in her lung and she died. And I listened to the tape at the police car, and to me the most heartbreaking and despicable words that came from either a police officer or one of the hospital staff, because the medical staff were also treating her this way, was, see, they thought, they accused her of pretending to not be able to breathe. And so they wouldn't treat her. It's like, get up, get up. And one of them said, one way or the other, you're going to jail. And I thought, well, that really sums up the attitude. One way or the other, you are going to jail. Now, this is a difficult question. It's the question raised by a desire to abolish prisons. Can we end rape culture and sexual violence without police and prisons? And we'll have to get in a longer discussion about what that means, what it means to aim to abolish prisons, what that process is, what that vision is. I don't have time to talk about it now, but it does mean working to develop collective efforts that rely on strengths and accountability of community members rather than on punitive state intervention, which, as I said, is often more violent than the intimate violence that the police were called to address. Instead of locking up more men, can we get them to see how patriarchal, heterosexist, and misogynistic norms repress their own sexualities and self-definition? The arts have provided a space where Black women can explore their own sexual desires, pleasures, and identities and create their own sexual ethics. Black working class women use the blues to exert control over their sexuality unconstrained both by white bosses and by the politics of respectability. They certainly weren't respectable. As Angela Davis points out in her book, Blues Legacies and Black Feminism, this is her study of Ma Rainey, Bessie Smith, and Billie Holiday, quote, considering the stringent taboos in representations of sexuality that characterized most dominant discourses of the time, the blues constitute a privileged discursive site. And Angela Davis calls on us to think about the blues and other musical expressions as a site for feminist consciousness and for imagining a liberated or liberated sexualities. In contrast to rappers who exploit sexual stereotypes of Black women, some Black women artists like Jill Scott, India Arie, Erykah Badu, and Angie Stone. Last night presented that list to my daughter, and she said, "That's so old, you're so old-fashioned." She told me I had to include Janelle Monáe. Right? Is that good? Okay. Janelle Monáe. Have employed sexuality symbolically in lyrics as a means to liberation from a subordinated role. They often sing about sexual relationships marked by mutuality rather than property. India Ari's Brown Skin is what immediately comes to mind. And I'm not going to sing it, but I will tell you the words. You all know it. I can probably say, "Come join me." Brown skin. Come on. You all don't know India Ari's Brown Skin? I see. You all can't sing. Okay, well, I'll say the words. Brown skin, you know I love your brown skin. I can't tell where yours begins. I can't tell where mine ends. Brown skin up against my brown skin. Need some every now and then. Oh, yeah. And, you know, I just love, it's like, first of all, she's glorifying brown skin, which just by itself is cool, right? And the way she describes her and her lover is, I don't know where I begin, I don't know where you end. It's a mutual relationship. It's not one exploiting the other or controlling the other. You know, it's just such a beautiful mutuality. And then she says, "Need some every now and then." So it's like, it's when I need some. You know, it's like you don't decide. So anyway, just in that one stanza, it just gives a taste of what a liberated sexuality, among others, might be. The great science fiction novelist Octavia Butler wrote, "There's nothing new under the sun, but there are new suns." And, you know, a lot of what I've been talking about would suggest that there's nothing new. The same images, the same ideologies, the same treatment that originated in slavery continues today. But, she says, but there are new suns. There's a new way of thinking. That we have to dislodge it from the old way of thinking. It has to be something completely new, a new sun, not just a new version of the old sun. And I am really new to Black women's speculative fiction. So please don't ask me any questions about it. But I have started reading. Everybody has said to me for so long, you have to read Octavia Butler. Her work, it's all about killing the black, you know, the answer to killing the black body. And in her parable series, Butler imagines a futuristic United States in which the protagonist, a black girl named Lauren Oya Olamina, is disabled by hyper-empathy. She physically experiences other people's pain and pleasure. And even though it's considered a disability, it's actually what then enables her to develop a radical and liberating ethic called Earthseed. So I am increasingly intrigued and drawn to speculative fiction and convinced that Black women's version of it may be our best hope for even imagining what liberated sexualities would look like. Black women need spaces like these to imagine and act out sexualities that aren't beholden to or relegated or regulated for the sake of an oppressive social order. Without stereotypes created to legitimize our violation and blame us for all the inhumanity done to us, without systems intent on locking us up, denying us protection, violating us, sterilizing us, taking away our children, without the fear of sanction imposed on everyone else who acts too much like us, or follows our lead. So what's so dangerous about Black women's sexuality? I can't wait to find out. Thank you.
Hi, Professor Roberts.
Oh, hi.
So I'm curious to know if you could draw out a little bit the paradox between the, I guess, marginalization of African American women, right? Demographically, we're 6% of the population. We're among the most under-resourced, and in many ways, politically, still struggle to have a voice. And then, as you said, this danger of our sexuality, you were saying that effectively it's because we pose this threat, right? We have no allegiance to, white patriarchy and capitalism because we don't benefit from it. So I guess I'm wondering if you could sort of explicate a bit more sort of this reality of our lived experience and the danger we pose. It seems like the danger is more at the site of ideology or discursive, but it's also centered in the institutions and the institutional assumptions. So I'm just wondering if you could sort of help us understand that dualism that seems to almost be a contradiction.
Yeah, I think it's related to the contradiction of, and maybe this is what you're saying, Black women being so marginalized from the sources of power. Have less wealth than others, higher rates of incarceration, poor health compared to other groups in this country, on all these different levels, marginalized from power, and yet depicted as if we are the ones that are the threat to social order in America and around the world. So is that the contradiction you're talking about? Yeah. So, so part of it has been created through myths, the stereotypes I talked about, and sometimes I feel that I spend too much focus on stereotypes. They're just images, but they really are powerful. The myth of the welfare queen really did fuel, and there's empirical studies that show this, really did have an effect on garnering support for the evisceration of public assistance to needy families. So, so part of it is these images that portray Black women as causing so much damage that far outweigh the actual damage that Black women are doing. I'll go back to that, the welfare queen. It simply is not the case that Black women had babies to get a welfare check, but that amount of the welfare check is so puny, it doesn't really harm the U.S. economy. If we want to talk about what harms the U.S. economy, we would be worried about the trillions of dollars that, I believe it was that much, that it took to repair the damage that banks and mortgage companies and other power brokers did to the economy. So it is an exaggeration, these myths that exaggerate the actual damage that Black women do or could do. Another example is incarceration of Black women. Most Black women who are incarcerated are there because of some trifling little thing. I mean, because they bought drugs, or they were and had a boyfriend who sold drugs, and they opened the door, or they wrote a bad check. I mean, little puny stuff. Or not even that, things even less than that. And yet, there's this image that these women have to be locked up to protect society. Much more harm has been done to them. Much more than they have ever done to anybody. So the stereotypes are really powerful in convincing some people that there really is this threat that doesn't exist materially. Now, you said at the ideological level. So, I think the threat, and I think what the Combahee River Collective was talking about, is the lack of allegiance that black women have, I'm talking broadly, obviously, there are many different, black women have many different statuses, some are wealthier than others, but just in terms, broadly speaking, of the status and the investment that black women have in racial purity, which is a big part of white supremacy, maintaining a privileged white race. Black women, by definition in this country, can't have white children, except through some, high-tech reproductive means, which most black women can't afford. Anyway, also are less likely than anybody to marry a white man. And, it's even deeper than that, but there's just two examples. So, black women's protest I think has great potential, because we're less likely, because of our political position in this country, to be co-opted by these institutions. And I think that's part of the reason why it's so important to paint black women as the women you don't want to be like. Because if more people wanted to be like us, and were willing to give up their privilege, whether it's a privilege of heterosexuality, a privilege of wealth, a privilege of race, privilege of masculinity, it would be a bigger material threat. I'll just give a couple examples of the child welfare system. The child welfare system, as I mentioned, is full of black children taken from their black mothers. And it is a way of dealing with struggling families in this country. It is an alternative to generously supporting families, especially single mothers. Now, why isn't there a massive movement by women in this country, especially women, because we're the ones who do most of the child care. It's not just women, let's just say, and all caregivers. All caregivers. I won't just leave it to women. But women have a bigger stake in it. Why? Why do we have this system that is so bad for all families? We don't have enough child care. Everybody is struggling for child care. I mean, even, the professors here. And you all will see too. It's a struggle to take care of kids while you're working. Why do we continue to have these puny policies? We won't even pay for family leave. You won't lose your job, but in this country you don't get paid unless you happen to work for somebody who has a policy. Well, by painting the child welfare system as a system and keeping it as a system for poor mothers of color, especially poor black mothers, and just to a lesser extent, just because of the population numbers, Native Americans, it's a barrier to organizing for a system that doesn't rely on foster care. And as I mentioned in my talk, not only is there not enough, I'm not saying there isn't any, but there's not enough of a movement for that, but there are some people, because of their race and because of their class, who disparage the mothers who have their kids taken away from them, distinguish their wonderful child care giving, which is not any different, they just have more resources, from theirs, and have even lobbied for legislation that makes it easier to terminate parents' rights so that these children can be available for adoption. And as I mentioned, I know I'm going on too long, and I would probably have to go on longer, and I hope everybody understands what I'm saying, because this is a touchy subject. I do not oppose transracial adoption, but I do oppose arguments to free black children from their bad mothers so that they can be adopted by white middle-class families. And there were white women who claimed to be feminists who argued for this. So it would be such a stronger movement if those women joined with black mothers for a stronger system of supporting families and reducing or even abolishing foster care. So hopefully that gives some idea of what that contradiction entails.
Well,
hi.
I was thinking about, do you think that the reason that there's an exclusion of African American women in the white feminist movement on the part of white females is because of a couple of things? Because they benefit from the system of oppression, and that it would create competition and challenge kind of their stance in terms of white supremacy with regards to the domestic capacity of African American women and also creating competition, which will create competition.
Well, one of the most powerful ways of thinking that is developed in America and other parts of the world is to convince white people that they have a stake in the subordination of black people, and that even when it would benefit them materially, as I was talking about having a stronger welfare state, for example, having universal health care, many would rather exclude black people from their organizing in order to and I mean organizing across the board, but even organizing for sexual liberation, because I think it's partly because they don't see it in their interest to go all the way and dismantle the institutions that maintain white dominance and black subordination. So part of it also, I think, is a lack of understanding of black women's experiences. I'll give the example of, now I have been organizing in reproductive justice for a long time, and I have lots of experience dealing with conflicts with white women organizers who simply were not aware of the experiences of black women. So, not being aware of the history of sterilization abuse of black women, maybe themselves having a hard time getting sterilized. You know, they're white in the 70s anyway, in the 80s, white women often were told they shouldn't be sterilized, especially if they were young, that they should be having more babies. At the same time that black women were being coercively sterilized. So when there was organizing for regulations in the late 70s to, now I read about this, I don't go that far back, to organizing for federal regulations that would at least limit sterilization abuse of Black and Latino women, primarily under government programs, there was resistance from some white women's organizations because their experience was, we are having difficulty getting access to sterilization. That has never been Black women's problem. So it was just a failure of understanding the history of Black women. But I'm not saying that's an excuse. There has to be more of a willingness, and I think this is, in some circles, this is improving dramatically. For one thing, Black women's organizing for reproductive justice has become more vocal, more, it has more resources, it is more prominent. And so there's more of an effort now, I think, for allies and collaboration between groups that were led primarily by white women and now these emerging groups and groups getting stronger and stronger led by Black women. But it's, I firmly believe that the movement for reproductive freedom in America would be much, much stronger if mainstream reproductive rights organizations like NARAL and Planned Parenthood truly took on a reproductive justice framework. As I mentioned in that march in 2004, it was much stronger, more powerful, both in numbers and in its impact and in its message, because of the shift from reproductive choice to reproductive justice. And there are still though, arguments made in these mainstream reproductive rights organizations that have a population control cast to it, that the reason for abortion rights or access to contraception is to reduce the costs of unwanted children. That's a bad argument. And I think paying more attention and give to Black women's perspectives and giving them more of a voice and a lead in these organizations would improve organizing, movement building for everybody. I hope that answered your question. I think this.
Thank you, Professor, for speaking to us. I had a question. So you just spoke about the movement of reproductive freedom being, having reproductive rights in it, or the right to choose in it, but it's not its totality. In that, when you have champions such as Black men who believe in reproductive freedom and reproductive justice, reproductive justice, but may not agree on the right to choose. Is that one issue, one that separates where it's take it all, or you can't have any of it? Or are there alliances that can be built when as Black men look at the effect that abortion has had on the population of the Black community and take it as a social justice issue from that lens, but still want to represent and uplift the rights of Black women and the freedoms of Black women to reproduce? Do you see that as take it all, or we don't want you a part of the movement? Or how do you see
that? It's very interesting though that you see the split as a gender split. Why? So I would first want to know, why is it that Black women are more likely to support the right to abortion than Black men? Now, if that's the case, I'm just going by your question. If that's the case, then I would want to question whether or not Black men might be willing to listen more to Black women about why it's important to have access to abortion as part of our reproductive freedom. So already I would want to approach it as, can we have a discussion so that, just as I was saying about different experiences and perspectives sometimes lead to different political positions, but that doesn't mean there can't be engagement and dialogue, especially when there's a common value there. So just what I was saying about white women and black women, if we have a common value of valuing the humanity of women, women's control over our bodies, sex being mutually agreed upon, things like, then can we understand that forcing someone to be sterilized is just as bad as denying them the right to abortion. And I would say the same thing about black men and women talking about reproductive justice. If we have a common goal, a common value, the humanity of black people, and a common struggle to liberate us, can we talk about why access to abortion is important for that it doesn't contradict it? That's how I would approach it. But I understand that wasn't exactly your question, but I think it is the case that, in my experience with black women-led reproductive justice organizations, there is more of an openness to women and men who oppose abortion, who see abortion as a harm to communities. I have definitely found more of an openness to that. But my own position is that what's important for white women and black men to see is that both the forced sterilization of women, the idea that black women shouldn't be having children, and the forced pregnancy, the idea that black women shouldn't have access to abortion, both of those are wrong. And reproductive freedom, sexual freedom requires, in my opinion, that women have control over their bodies, both to decide not to have a child, but also to decide to have a child. And that's how I would want to reconcile it. Thanks for your question.
Thank you, Professor Roberts, for the wonderful speech. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts about, you're talking about building allyship between white women and black women. What about allyship between black women and other women of color?
Oh, absolutely, yes. Yes.
Other communities
Yes.
who identify as sexually marginalized.
Yes.
The recent cooptation of any kind of sexual minority positions with the gay white movement. And what are your thoughts about that?
Yes. Well, I'm sorry I didn't talk more about that because my talk focused on black women, but reproductive justice organizing and the movement for reproductive justice, the development of that framework has involved collaborations between black, mostly women-led organizations and organizations led by women of color from many different groups. And it has also centered sexual freedom for people who are lesbian, gay, transgender as well, queer people as well. So that's always been very important to reproductive justice. One of the important aspects of reproductive justice organizing is that because it starts from a recognition of interlocking systems of oppression, it tends to work across movements, collaborating across movements, across different identity-based movements, different movements that are focused on various aspects of oppression. So if you want to know more, I actually wrote an article called Movement Intersectionality on this topic with an organizer. I was in the inaugural board. It's a small organization. She was the executive director. And the whole point of our organization was to build collaborations across movements, especially those where there had been divides in the past. And the one we worked on the most, and this is something I haven't raised, and it's very important to me, is disability rights activists and women's rights and reproductive justice activists. And we worked on opposing the argument for abortion that it's necessary to avoid the birth of children with disabilities, for example, because that we felt was not respecting the humanity of people with disabilities, and also diverting attention from the need to end discrimination against people with disabilities. So that's just one example, again, where we looked at common values, common goals, common struggles in order to build coalitions for a common mission for reproductive justice that takes into account justice across all of these different identities and political positions.
I think we have time for one last question.
And by the way, Sister Song, which I mentioned a couple times, is a collective of women of color organizations. It's not a black-only organization. It's a women of color collective. Yeah, there's a hand there.
So much of the Q&A has hinged on the contradiction between you will have birth control forced on you versus you may not have access to birth control, including abortion.
Yeah.
And isn't it true, or that's my way of loading the question, isn't it true that if you listen to white supremacists very carefully, they tell you exactly what that dynamic is and what the underlying fears are. And it is that white skin is essentially, can be seen as a recessive trait genetically. And if fertility rates can't be controlled all the time, there's another aspect of controlling the viability of the offspring. And viability of offspring has a specific biological meaning, but you can also extend it to a cultural meaning. So an offspring who is more likely disproportionately to be in jail or not have child care or not have a decent education or health care is going to be less viable. And so that's a structure that, of course, will perpetuate a system that goes back millennia of privilege. And the other aspect in this contradiction seems to me to be, it also reaches back to agrarian societies where children had a vital economic impact on the survival of the family. I mean, they were necessary in agrarian societies. So you again have this tension of the danger being women's sexuality outside of a contractual relationship being dangerous because of these ideas about surviving on a farm that we've all inherited and that we all carry, not even mentioning the associated aspect of the economics of enslavement.
Yeah, so I think I think what you're giving are some biological explanations for white supremacy, and I think everything you're saying I think is consistent with how I would explain it. Except that the problem I have with biological explanations is it makes it seem inevitable. So it makes it seem inevitable that white people will want to dominate other people because they want to maintain, white skin. And when I said that black women don't have an investment in racial purity the way that white people do because they can't have white children, I didn't mean that, but I said that's because that's the way it was set up. So again, I don't want to disagree with you in the sense that again, what you said could support my point, but I want to emphasize that this is a political decision. This is a political way of thinking. It was a whole apparatus set up that way so that, in fact, even the very invention of race was set up that way. The invention that there are white people, there are black people, there are yellow people, there are red people, all of that was invented in order to give white people a political position of dominance and then create a whole legal and political apparatus, including the definition of who is white and who is black, including the legal result that if a white man, a white slaveholder rapes one of his enslaved females, that the child could be enslaved. That was created to support white supremacy. And the reason why I don't like to give a biological explanation for it is because then, just like the biological explanation of race and racial inequality, it's not our fault. There's nothing we can do. That's just the way nature is. Everything I talked about today is about explaining race and sex inequality as natural and how we can contest that. The reason why we can contest it is because it's not natural. It's not natural. It is set up that way. And being convinced it's natural, which is the whole, that's so deeply embedded in the way we think about sex and race. It's all natural. It's such a powerful way of legitimizing an unjust, inhumane system and keeping people from contesting it and fighting against it. So I would describe it differently. I appreciate what you're saying. And I think that there is for some white people a fear of dilution of their race. I mean, eugenics was all about that, the intersection of eugenics and anti-miscegenation. It was all about that. But the real fear is loss of privilege and power. It's not a biological fear. It's a fear of the loss of a privileged position in society. And that fear, and to go back to an argument I was making, that fear is linked to a fear of black women's sexuality, and it is linked to a resistance to change that actually would be in everybody's material benefit, except the most powerful people who want to keep things the way they are. So I would just say, I guess this is the last question, I would just say, resist the myth that race is natural, that sex and race and class and other inequalities are natural and there's nothing we can do about it, and fight to change it. We can change it, and I think that black women's resistance gives us such an exciting inspiration to change it, that even under all those terrible conditions I described, Black women have been able, even if it's just in music and in speculative fiction, to imagine another way of living that is not repressed and oppressed and dehumanized by this political system of race and sex inequality. So I'll leave it at that.